The date is May 22nd, 2017. This is Tina Peabody, and I'm speaking with Mr. Thyagarajan, or Thyag, former Executive Director of the Capital District Regional Planning Commission, or CDRPC, between 1972 and 1980. And we are speaking in his home this morning. Thyag, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
You're welcome.
I thought we'd just start by talking about how you came to work at the CDRPC.
Well, I came back from London. I was in London, and then I came back to the my home state at that time was near in Detroit area. So I was looking for a new job. And there are several opportunities to work in different cities in the United States. And I checked this one out because I wanted to be the director of an agency, not as number two. And that's why I said, okay, let me try this out. And they called me for an interview and all that. And they chose me. You want me to tell you why they chose me?
Of course.
Well, the Regional Planning Commission, like lots of commissions across the country, were required to prepare a regional plan. That was required by the federal government. At that time, in those days, the federal government's Department of Housing and Urban Development was very much in charge of funding regional agencies. And the planning process required a regional commission to have a regional plan in order for the projects to be evaluated against it. So, and I had done lots and lots of plans like that before. I did a plan in Detroit, did a plan in Baltimore, did a plan in Yugoslavia. So when I came here for the interview, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for somebody with experience in having prepared plans, and I fit their bill, and that's how I got hired by them.
So you mentioned the regional plan, and we'll get into the specifics of that in a minute. And that's part of the CDRPC mission.
Yeah.
But actually, before we even talk about the regional plan, can you tell us a little bit about why the CDRPC was formed and its primary mission?
The CDRPC was formed again as a requirement of a federal mandate. So metropolitan areas across the United States, all of them, all the major metropolitan areas, were required to form a regional agency. And the regional agency was the only way to enable local counties and communities to get funds. So it's very important creating a commission like that, and they're voluntary to some extent, but almost every metropolitan area, about 200 plus metropolitan areas in the United States, that created regional planning commission about the same time. So that was part of the mission. The communities themselves were in two minds about whether such a commission was required or not. But it was, in those days, the federal government's role in planning and so forth was very, very extensive, and the federal government and the state. And that's how it started. So this is a requirement by the federal government to create regional agencies.
And just before we move on, so you said the federal government was highly involved and also the state. Could you talk a little bit about the state's involvement?
State's involvement primarily as a partial funding for certain portions of the planning process. But the bulk of the money came from the federal government. I think, forget now the amount of money, the percentage-wise, at least we're 70%, 75%.
And let's talk again, about the mission of the CDRPC. So it was partly to create this regional plan. It's partly because of these federal mandates. But would you talk a little bit about how the mission evolved over time? Because I think especially during your tenure, it changed a lot in terms of what the commission was.
Well, it didn't change very much during my period, because after I finished the plan, we were into doing some subcomponents of the plan, a housing plan, this and that. So there's a whole bunch of plans prepared. And before I came, the regional agency was already involved in lots and lots of studies. They did a study on sewer systems, that whole lot of infrastructure items were already done by the commission staff. Chen was there at that time, and before me, there was gentleman by the name of Louis Lex was the director. I never met him. But so once I got there, the primary mission was to execute the plan. So we had a big staffing increase. We went from about six or seven people to a total of 22 when I left. So the amount of money that we got from the federal government and so forth really ballooned the size of the agency. And this was not just in Albany, it was also in other metropolitan areas. Now, one of the interesting things is the federal government created a process called the A95 review process. I don't know whether you heard about that. A95 process is any project of any kind in your region that has federal funds associated with it, that project must be cleared by the Regional Planning Commission. So that is called the A95 process. So in order to give legitimacy to the review, and you'll be interested to know that the projects that are brought before the commission had all kinds of projects, not just physical planning projects. Projects such as social, criminal justice, social issues, all of these projects came for review by the commission. And we had to make a determination, not me, but the commission, the total commission members, they voted on each project. And so every board meeting that we had once a month or so, whole slew of these projects will come as a part of the agenda for the commission meeting.
And so, okay, so you mentioned sort of the staffing changes that happened as part of your tenure. Were there any other shifts in priorities when you took over from Louis Lex Jr. as executive director?
He wasn't there when I got there. Chen was managing it for a while, in between. I never met him. I have no idea who he was. We were out there in Elnora, our office. And there's a whole story behind that which I don't want to get into.
So let's go back to the regional plan, because like you said, it's a huge part of what you were working on at that time. And can you talk a little bit about the development of that plan?
Well, the plan development process is very, very complicated. Basically, what you have to do is to collect all kinds of information. You have to collect demographic data, you have to collect physical data, you have to collect transportation data, you have to collect the environmental data, all of these data items. And they are documented as tabular form, but also they're mapped. We had a map size about 4.5 feet by 6 feet, mylar. And in those days, we didn't have computers. We did it all by hand. So I created a work table where the staff could work on, with a glass top and a light below. So we created a mylar background base map from USGS maps. You know USGS maps? United States Geological Survey maps. They were put together, and that formed the base map. And then so on, layer after layer, we will create about 10 or 12 layers of information, and that information was then carefully analyzed for commonalities, and we created areas where development was possible, areas where development should not take place. So in effect, we created an envelope for a development plan based on the criteria that are established in terms of the different maps. So that's how the plan was done. It's more complicated, but there are documents that you can review that I'm sure that Mark can make available.
And so, what were some of the key findings?
Well, the interesting thing is, if I remember correctly, at that time, the region was about 750,000 people. And that time, the region was Albany County, Schenectady County, Rensselaer County, and Saratoga, the 4 counties. And the development in Albany area was focused on the 3 major cities, Albany, Troy, and Schenectady. And in between, unlike many metropolitan regions, the development took place in between these cities. That means, for instance, Saratoga area, because of the I-8s and the Northway, became a hot corridor for development. and then similarly going towards Bethlehem. So when you look at the map of Albany at that time, and look at the housing patterns and the retail and transportation patterns, it was a very spread out area. But the land availability was enormous, the total amount of land. So one of the problems that we thought would be a problem is that since easy access to the Northway is so easily obtainable, there would be helter-skelter development. So one of the ideas behind the plan was to try to curtail and maximize the development potential within this boundary area, not go spill all over the area and make it very difficult to provide services. So that was one of the major criteria. And then, of course, there are other issues like deterioration of the center city. How can you overcome that? The issues that we now talk about, we still talked about then. So we dealt with things like rehabilitation, renewal, infill development, new development in locations where you can build high-density development, and then suburban areas. So in effect, the planning process identified several alternative ways in which you can develop the region. One was a continuation of existing trends. That means let it go the way it is. Don't bother, development will take place as primarily a market force related thing. Other is modest change in existing development pattern. That means try to control it a little bit. Third one was concentrated development. That means bring everything tight together and redevelopment of existing cities. So there are basically three, four alternatives. And then we looked at all that, and we invited all the county planners to take a look at it, and we built models, physical models of how this development would look like. We had little cylinders of plastic that would lay on the map and show how the different patterns would emerge. Have you seen any of that?
I don't think I've seen the physical maps, no. I've seen the regional plan.
You've seen the regional plan. Mm. I got some of the documents upstairs, but we'll see.
There's a wealth of material still in a lot of these hand-drawn maps, which is pretty amazing.
I don't know whether they saved all that. These mylars, have you seen those mylars?
I think Mark has one or two, at least.
We had a whole stack of them. And they're all pieces of artwork, they're extraordinary. All done by hand, slowly but surely.
Quick follow-up question. So you mentioned doing it all by hand. Had that changed by the time you left the CDRPC?
No, it didn't change. The big computer revolution didn't take place till about late 80s. Yeah, now everything is done by the computer.
Okay, so you talked about some of the key findings of the regional plan, and part of it is obviously controlling suburban sprawl. Mm-hmm. How do we plan suburbanization so that we can provide services? To what extent do you think the CDRPC was able to influence the development of the capital region through these recommendations in the regional plan?
Modestly. To some extent, one of the things that CDRPC did is particularly in the latter stages, especially in the last 15 years, and I wasn't there at that time, that the commission became a friend of the communities. Instead of saying you shall do this, you shall do that, the commission staff, especially the director, Rocky was a good director, Chen was a good director, they would engage the communities and say, what can we do for you? Get involved in the planning process. At the same time, another important component is we had a very good, very creative regional metropolitan planning agency, transportation planning agency. And the director of that agency was a guy by the name of John Poorman. And John, he recently died, but he was extraordinary. He brought together, he created a planning process himself, along with us, along with the Regional Planning Commission, to create opportunities for verifying and taking care of special issues in each community. So instead of being the federal bureaucrat telling people what to do, the commission changed its style of modus operandi and became partners with the community. And that way, I think they accomplished a lot more than because regional planning commissions were perceived by the local government as intrusive. They were not helpful, or all they wanted to do is to tell us what to do. And that changed quite a bit in the last, I would say, in the last 15 years.
And so how would you say, actually, let me put it this way, because you're sort of also now mentioning the relationship between the CDRPC and the counties. Mm-hmm. And so why don't we talk a little bit about what that relationship actually was, the relationship between the CDRPC and its Board of Commissioners, and how that shifted over time, because I assume that's part of this community partnership that you're describing as well.
The CDRPC, one of the things to remember is that local agencies did not have much of planning staff at that time. Most of the staff, in fact, most of the work that was done in terms of planning for communities was done by consultants. It's only after the Regional Planning Commission and then the funding started ballooning for local agencies that counties created their own staff. And now, of course, each county has got a fairly good staff, planning staff. In those days, it was not so. But slowly but surely, Saratoga County always had a good planning program. Schenectady County had a few planners. Rensselaer County, hardly any. Albany County, for some reason, did not have many planners at that time. Right now, Albany City of Albany is well staffed. But they all started improving their skill set. So in effect, entire regional agencies and the counties and so forth increased the total quality of staffing all over the place. And so in effect, there's much more of a professional relationship between the local agencies and the CDRPC and the region and the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is the transportation agency. So there's generally speaking, a gradual evolution for highly professional relationships. And you know how the commission was formed, right? The composition of the commission.
Let's talk about that. Actually, I think it would be good to.
The commission,
have it on the record.
The commission itself was formed by the appointment of 3 members by the County Board of Supervisors. Excuse me. So each 3 members, so that's a total of 12 commissioners. And one of the interesting things is all the commissioners are very conscious of their protecting their turf, the county where they represented, but when they came to the commission meeting, they understood that their responsibility was to deal with the regional issues. So they left their baggage behind them. When they walked in my office door, they were regional people, and they were very, very conscious, and they're very smart people, and they understood the tension between taking care of their own base. It's what a typical politician goes through, you know. They have to worry about that, you know, like these congressional people are going back home and getting beat up, you know. Same kind of thing. So they have to protect their turf, but at the same time they have to make a balance between what they need to worry about back home versus what is for the regional good. For instance, if you look at transportation transcends all boundaries. Environmental quality transcends all boundaries, right? Air quality transcends all boundaries. Sewer and water systems transcend most boundaries. So each of these things become a regional issue which cannot be solved by one county or one community. So that recognition becomes more and more evident and the commissions also go through an educational process themselves, because they say, what am I doing here? What's the Regional Planning Commission all about? So, and many of the commissioners were there for a long time, so there's a lot of continuity in the process by which they were not appointed and taken out. They maintained their position over a long period of time. So there was continuity in the way they let me close that window down. Excuse me. Excuse me, I'm overcoming a cold and stuff like that. Okay. Anything else? Keep going.
You can continue your thought if you were finishing your thought.
Well, I think that fairly wraps it up. in terms of what the dynamics are between the commission and the director of the commission, which is me or Chen or Rocky or whatever. They are responsible for managing the planning process, taking care of daily business and all of that. It's a lot of paperwork that goes through and a lot of analysis done by the staff all the time. So, but the director controls the staff and manages the staff, but the staff is not sitting in the back room. They will come to the board meeting and participate in the discussion. So we had a fairly open process. So if there's a particular project where it has to be reviewed and it required a particular skill set, that particular person would come to the board meeting and explain what's going on.
So you have the CDRPC with a staff of professional planners.
Right.
And then you have a board of commissioners,
Right.
which at the time was 12 people.
12 people.
Eventually was increased to 20,
Yeah.
who are not planners, but as you said, politicians.
Politicians, but some of them had professional background, but not necessarily in planning. They may be lawyers, they may be engineers, you know. The town supervisor would be there sometimes.
And what was the relationship like between the planners and the commissioners? Because your priorities are slightly different.
No, it was very good. We knew that they controlled the system. So we always a differential to the commission. We wouldn't tell them, you can't do that. We say, well, this is what our conclusions are, what are you, and they'll vote on it. Most of it's a consensus, but most of the time, sometimes it'll be split vote, maybe instead of 12 all agreeing on one, they'll say, okay, 10 against 2, you know. So by and large, it was very consensus oriented.
And so let's go back to the regional plan for just a moment, just because, so you said that through sort of working with the commissioners, working with the local government, you building this sense of regional concern, you were able to moderately influence the development of the capital region. Would you talk a little bit more about that and what parts of the regional plan you think you were able to implement and what parts you were not?
Most of the time was influencing the metropolitan systems like sewer and water locations, and to some extent the environmental relationships. So if a project comes in line that looks like it's not appropriately located, we would talk about it and recommend not against it, but ask the project people to go back and review the situation. But when I said modest, it's really true that we as a commission did not have a very great say in the projects that are put up by developers. A developer comes up with a proposal for a project. It goes to the local town, and then it gets filed with the county. And they have to look at it, and they usually would make up their mind. But it may not come to the commission at all if there's no funding issues associated with it. It will sail right through. So in effect, if there's a project that doesn't have any federal involvement, it won't come to us at all. So, I mean, I think that's true. You know, I've been so long away from it, but that's about right. And in the area that I think the commission has had most success is a connection between transportation and land development, and that has become more and more of a positive thing in the last 15 years. That's, you know, long after I left.
Can you talk a little more about that?
Because transportation is extraordinarily important in terms of connectivity, in terms of development. So if you plan a transportation network that responds to land use development criteria and so forth, you're automatically building in a planning process that is sensible. So, when you create a plan, a framework plan, so to speak, at the county level or the local level, that plan has built into it a controlling mechanism just because the way systems are laid out. We don't have, there's a particular kind of development process that is used in other regions in the United States, very few of them, and that is to create an outer belt of development line. They say this is a development boundary. That was not very popular in the Albany area, because that says you shall not put any development past that line, because that's your boundary with the metropolitan area. But by carefully orchestrating the connection between transportation and land development, you can create the same outcome. And the other thing that makes it also workable is transportation and sewer and water. Sewer, water, transportation, and land development all go together, because if you have excuse me, if you have a piece of land that is not properly provided with water and sewer services, you cannot build. Now, for instance, one of the things that has happened quite a bit, we have a lot of development in the Capital District and other parts of the world, other parts of the United States, where septic tanks are used as development. Septic tanks are okay for a period of time, but then eventually the county finds out, and the developer and the town in which the development is there find out that they need to connect the sewer system. Now, if that process had been thought about beforehand, they would not have developed it. But developers have the private sector development process is very independent, and they don't really want to be told how to do it. So if the piece of land is capable of being served by a sewer system, by a septic tank system, that's what they'll go for, because it's the cheapest way to do it. But then it gets very expensive once you have to reconnect to the main sewer system of the county. Then the homeowner is saddled with another big chunk of money that he has to pay out to get the system connected. So nowadays, I think it's getting more and more complicated, and I think developers or the county planners are now looking very carefully at this thing and saying, what's your plan for connecting the system? So those issues, in some parts of the Capital District, especially Rensselaer County, you cannot build a septic system because the soil conditions are not appropriate. So the only way you can, that's one of the reasons why Rensselaer County doesn't have much development, because it's high. Excuse me, I gotta get some water. You okay? You want some water?
I'm okay, thank you.
I'm overcoming the cold, and that's why I saw this going on. We also have a regional authority, as you know, on public transportation, the Capital District Transportation Authority. And they are also good participants in the planning process. CDTA, are you familiar with that? The bus guys.
Yeah, actually, since we're talking about transportation, you have a relationship, the CDRPC had a relationship both with the CDTA and the CDTC.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, again, those development, we always had a conversation going on. You know, in the early days when I was the director of the agency for the state of New York's transportation department controlled all transportation networks. They had a metropolitan organization that was staffed and funded by the state DOT. So there was not enough independence on part of the transportation agency at the local level. But then what happened was, again, the federal government said, we need independent transportation planning agencies for all regions. So they did the same thing for transportation that they did for planning. So the MPO. The MPO is the official title of these planning organizations. The transportation planning organizations were called MPOs. And John Poorman, who originally started working for me at CDRPC, he branched out and then he became the director of the transportation authority of the MPO. So there was a continuity between what he was doing, and so he was able to, along with all the metropolitan planning organizations across the state of New York, became a lot more independent. The state still had control on parts of it in terms of funding, but by and large, CDTA, which is a public authority with the mandate for regional planning for transportation for the region, CDTC, which is the MPO, and CDRPC. So these three organizations worked very closely together. So that level of coordination makes it possible to get a lot of stuff done quietly.
And so you have some examples of, because you mentioned transportation as one important aspect of the regional plan. So do you have any examples of projects that the CDRPC did with the CDTC or the CDTA?
I wouldn't be able to speak to it because it all happened after I left. But there's a planning process that CDTC, which is the MPO, has started about 15 years ago, and they're still going very strong. It's called the Linkage Program. And you should be talking to Rocky. He probably knows more about it than I do. But the linkage process was to, at the invitation of the local community, the MPO would create a planning process for a particular corridor, for a particular area, because the community says, we can use your help in developing a local plan that's sensitive to both land use and transportation. So there's linkage studies that are implemented, and they're all very successful. And it's worth bringing that up with the next person you're going to talk to. But the linkage planning process was something that John initiated, John Poorman, and it's still going strong. And are you talking to anybody in CDTC and the MPO?
Not for this project, no.
Yeah, but I think it might be a good idea to get Rocky's ideas on that, because he's probably much closer to that.
Well, let me just finish following up on the regional plan, because you've talked about some things that you think were implemented well. Where did you think it fell short?
Well, there's one item that's really interesting. In I think it was 1977, the federal government created, this is under Jimmy Carter's administration, created a housing program that was required to be affordable. It was a fair housing program. So the federal government said, one of your responsibilities, meaning us, the region planning, one of your responsibilities is to create a regional affordability plan where poor people and people with income are provided equal opportunity or reasonable opportunity in suburban locations. So in effect, the whole idea of creating a fair housing plan was laid on us. That went down like a lead balloon, because we had to go and in order for federal funding for housing to be made available, 75% of the community should say yes. So the community said, what are you telling me, Thyag? Well, you got to have so many more poor people in your community. And poor people, and you don't want to, I said, poor people meant, for instance, if you put black people in a community. Oh, geez, that's not a good idea. So all kinds of, and that did not go well, and we got a lot of crap on that, because we had to go, my staff and myself, we had to go and talk to these communities about this fair housing plan, and we had to develop, believe it or not, we had to develop statistical tables that said you should have at least so many people of this income range in your community. Well, they don't want to be told that. So that was not a very good idea. There's again, we were made to be the person with the stick we didn't get any sweets to give out, but we only got the sticks. So I don't think that was a very good plan. It's not the right way to do it. You know, there are lots of cases that are still pending out in the New York region, downstate. Housing affordability plan, and there's one called Mount Laurel, which is still not solved, where the federal mandate said you shall create housing opportunities for poor people in your community, and this is what you should do. And technically, the case was won by the federal government in the local region, but nothing has happened out of that.
And were you able to make any other progress on housing, or was that
Most,
pretty much the end?
you know, the interesting thing is what we recommended way back then has become now more or less accepted gospel, because the private developer is now seeing that intensifying development in the suburban areas is a smart thing. Remember, we said we should build our communities in tight clusters, and we can provide good transit, and this people can walk to work, or you know, be accessible to shops and stuff like that. In the center of the town, center of Clifton Park, center of Half Moon, and so forth, should create itself as a town center. Idea of town centers became a rallying point now, because the developer said, gee, that's not such a bad idea. We can build some apartments there. We can build some retail there. And they're close to the Northway, close to this. We'll do that. So the private sector itself picked up on the idea. And then the other thing that's very interesting is, you know what happened in the 40s and 50s, department stores left downtown. So retail deserted downtowns, and downtowns are suffering tremendously. So you think about that and say, what happened here? So now more and more developers are saying we should take another look at the center, because we have exhausted the landscape and development opportunities. We should come back into cities and find out new opportunities. So this, what's happening is there's a turnaround, and it's not uniform, it's not a big thing, but there is more incentive on the part of the developer to come back into town and redo things. So building apartments in the center city. Nobody built any new units in the center, but now you can see apartments being built in Albany and Schenectady, and there's a lot of renewal going on, and a lot of what we call infill. We used the term infill long time ago about this, and the infill process is now taking place everywhere. So the planning process, excuse me, the planning process that we recommended as a control system has become accepted as a development process. So the developer got smart, not because we told them to do, but they themselves realized it is in our best interest not to just keep on spreading out. We should come back and do, because there's a lot of underserved population in the city, which is a market that we have missed. So I always say that in the planning business, the United States is a mixed economy. It's not entirely capitalistic, it is not entirely government-owned, but there's a connection between the two. But the lead agency for development is the private sector. Except for big civic projects that are built by government, most of the initiative for development comes from the private sector. So the private sector sees opportunities that is, for instance, one of the things that would happen on a regular basis, the smart developers would come to my office and say, Thyag, what do you think of the idea of doing this? They would come and consult with us, because we were recognized by the private developer as smart people, because they have the data and they can tell us what works and all that. So we would have a frank conversation. We wouldn't tell them you should do this and you should do that. But they got a lot of data from us. And CDRPC provides extraordinary amount of services right now. And when it started, while I was there, we created data systems of various kinds to provide timely information for people. So when you are recognized as a lead agency for providing information, private developers who are smart would come to you. So in effect, part of it is control, a lot of it is cooperation. That's how it works.
So I guess I'll ask this one follow-up question. So in part, it seems as though you see part of the success of the CDRPC is figuring out not only how to work with local governments, figuring out how to work with the private sector.
Right.
And then one thing that you mentioned, you were quoted as in an article as saying that one of your big contributions was also creating a sense of community. And so it seems like the CDRPC has to reach out to the private sector, it has to reach out to local governments, but also sort of, in many ways, maybe get the community on your
Sure.
your side. So can you talk about what you mean about building a sense of community and maybe...
Well, it's very complicated. You can't really pinpoint anything. It's the more people see you as a legitimate organization who don't have an axe to grind, they will come to you. So you'll have people consulting with you and talking to you, and then we go out and talk to people. For instance, when we finished the regional plan in 1975, we took the plan to the communities. You know how we did it? We got a bus for $1 from CDTA, one of the abandoned buses, which is in good working order. We gutted the bus and created an exhibit inside showing the regional plan. And we took to various shopping centers, and people came and saw that plan. How much impact it had, I don't know, but we tried as much as possible to go out to public meetings and talk about our activity, but it's hard to judge. We didn't make any concern like these days. You like what you're doing, make surveys about how successful was it. We didn't do any of that, so it's just by hearsay and people telling you, "Gee, that was not a bad idea." You gave them good advice.
Let's transition a little bit and talk about some other specific projects. One thing I wanted to ask you about was the port. The port was the focus of a lot of developmental concern in this period. So would you talk a little bit about the CDRPC goals for the Port of Albany during your time?
Well, all right. We actually did a plan for the Port of Albany, and it was at the behest of the mayor of the city of Albany, Mayor Corning. And what he said was, Thyag, there's a lot of problems in the port, and I don't want to deal with it directly, but you can do it. Why don't you, because we had an economic development grant, challenge grant from the federal government, the Economic Development Agency, EDA. So we applied for the grant to fund a study of the Port of Albany, and we got it. So we went to the mayor and said, Mayor, we need 20% or 25% of your city money to study the port. And he said, okay, you got it. So we got a project together to go and investigate the Port of Albany, city of Albany Port. We looked at the management, we looked at this and that, and we said to the mayor quietly, these are some of the issues. And he says, what do you mean? No, there doesn't seem to be any transparency in how things are done. So we made some recommendations on how to do that. I don't know whether I could say we claim any special credit for that, but we made some reports for the Port of Albany that was very useful for the Port Commission to work with. That was the early stage. I don't think, and we didn't pursue that ourselves, but at that time there were several organizations in the port. Cargill was there, and 2 or 3 big companies that are using the port. But now it's becoming bigger, and at that time also, there was this transshipment of automobiles across, coming to the Port of Albany and being transshipped across the country to other sides. VWs all over the place, but I don't think that sort of died after a while. Transshipment point. Most of the port activity, even today, I think, is a bulk cargo. There's not much container traffic moving around. I don't know. I don't know what's the current situation, but they have done a lot of improvements of the port infrastructure, so it's a lot more powerful as a transshipment area than it used to be. But there was also something that I was not involved in, but it's become an issue. The Port of Albany sits next to poor community, black community, and there's always a tension between the port development and the community. So oil shipments and this and that, this is some issues. So those are not solved yet, but the Port of Albany is an important infrastructure for the Albany area. And it's still, I don't know if it's growing or not, because I'm not close to it, but it's something worth looking at.
And can I ask you specifically about the container barge idea that was being pushed by the CDRPC at this time?
I don't know anything about it. That's relatively recent. It wasn't in my time.
So actually, let me follow up on another point that you made. You talked about the tensions, the racial tensions at the Port of Albany. To what extent do you think you found race playing a role in planning overall at your during your time?
From a regional planning perspective, not much, but it had some. It is a concern in terms of providing equal services. For instance, in the capital district, the concentration of black population is entirely in two areas, the South End and Arbor Hill. And that hasn't changed over history. There are lots of out-migration of well-to-do black people in the suburbs, but by and large, the current concentration is in South End and Arbor Hill, and to some extent, West Albany. And that concentration of people there is in and of itself not a major problem, but what happens is, because they are not, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You heard that? Well, when poor people are usually underserved by governments, for whatever reason, I wouldn't say it's deliberate or anything like that, but they're not in adequate retail operations. So they're still trying to get a supermarket built in Arbor Hill. Still, what they call them, food deserts. Those kinds of issues are still, but there's not much that you can do in the regional level. It's got to be done at the city level. And there's got to be incentives offered for developers to be able to do that. Now, there's more and more interest in redeveloping central city areas. For instance, there's a project that's going on in the valley here in Albany, the Sheridan Hollow. Are you familiar with that? Sheridan Hollow?
No, I'm not.
Well, that's an area that's a poor area, but now it's becoming a hot spot for development because it's become Habitat for Humanity is involved in it, and so in effect there are some encouraging signs that there's a turnaround on providing decent housing for people. So it's all slow. It takes a long time.
So this is a little bit of a shift, but I thought I'd ask you, and in part because we've talked a lot about making the CDRPC a legitimate organization in the community, in the local government. And there was a citizen advisory committee. It was formed before you were there, I believe. And can you talk about the ability of citizens to participate in this project of regional planning? How you involved citizens, if at all, and what influence they may have had? The League of Women Voters had a regional agency, regional organization, which took Regional Planning Commission as its major project. The League of Women Voters. They created they had at that time a regional organization, and the regional organization said, we're going to take CDRPC under our wing and keep following them as to what they're doing. So that was the only regional organization that I can think of that had a citizens advisory group. We didn't have any at that time, separate from what the league was involved in. Where did you hear this about the Citizens Advisory Committee? Oh, I'm talking about annual reports and things like that. Although I wasn't sure exactly when it started and when it ended, so it may be that it was before your time. It wasn't clear.
I don't think there's anything before my time. I think it's probably after my time, most likely.
But this League of Women Voters, you said
That was contemporaneous because they're particularly interested in the plan that we were preparing, to make sure that the plan was something that they could look at and participate in, and they were very involved in it.
in the regional plan.
Yeah.
And so, what aspects specifically were they?
They're interested in everything. They wanted to know how we are doing it, what is the plan about, what is the fairness issues involved in it, and there's a woman by the name of Lucy Ambach, who was the chairwoman of the commission of the league, and she was the wife of the education commissioner, Gordon Ambach, and she was very smart, and the league, as you probably know, the League of Women Voters, the junior league, the women who participate in them are very smart people. They are very intelligent, they are professionals, and they spend a lot of time looking at documents. So in effect, they don't come and say, hey, tell us more, but they review material and they ask the questions. So the league is always a good group.
So, are there any other particular projects that you would like to highlight during your time that you felt were particularly important? You've made some reference to things like sewerage, water. Is there anything else that you think is particularly important that stands out?
We also did a study of the airports. And the primary reason for that, again, was a requirement for the Federal Aviation Administration to have a plan developed to the Albany County Airport, the Schenectady Airport, to make sure that there was consistency between land use planning and airport development, because as you know, the noise issue is a big issue at the airport. So we were the lead agency for preparing those plans, and those are good documents, and it gave the board commission, the airport agency, and this federal government a blueprint to use in terms of controlling development around it. So it was that's pretty good.
I'm going to shift and ask a couple of questions too about some contemporary issues that it seems as though would make a big impact on your perspective on planning. So during your time, the environmental movement is coming into sort of full bloom. How would you say that influenced what the CDRPC decided to do, if at all?
Well, the environmental control systems were beginning to start having impact, and we had to look at the projects in terms of their. We did not do the detailed analysis because the DEC does all that, Department of Environmental Conservation. But when a project would come and the questions were asked, we want to make sure that it was environmentally sustainable. So the Regional Planning Commission would make sure that the project that was proposed by anybody, whether it is a government project or whatever, met the requirements. And that's a relatively pro forma thing, because most agencies were told that they had to do water quality. You have to look at water quality, and we're not technically competent to judge that. But did they go through the process of reviewing that? So planning processes would. So there's again the coordination between the state level, the federal level, the state level, and the local level, and the Regional Planning Commission or the regional agencies are all intertwined processes. So in effect, when some project comes to us that looks to be questionable or needs more data, we would call the appropriate agencies and say, is there any issue here? So there's always a network of informal planning connectors, where planners know each other and they ask the questions. So lots of things are solved by not necessarily going to the board level, but getting done at the staff level.
And also, the energy crisis also hits during your time. Would you say that affected your planning priorities at all?
The big issue at that time was not so much energy per se, but our concern that development was getting so out of bounds that it was very hard to provide public transportation in an effective manner. So the connection between transportation and land use in terms of density development and so forth was a concern from us, because we were saying if we improve transit systems and make it better, we reduce the amount of energy consumed, but we more importantly, we'll provide better quality of service. So at that time, we were not making that much. We were making some connection, but we were not saying you're going to save this much gallons of gas or whatever, but more in terms of quality of service to the community. Is there, how do people get around? They always have to use a car. Can we reduce car ownership? Because car ownership is a big problem. When you get older, very young, in a typical community, there are a whole bunch of people who cannot drive or not. There are participants in driving a car, so they need help. You got CDTA's got the IRAD program and various other things, but if you can provide bus service of quality, that'd be good. But then CDTA cannot provide bus services everywhere because it's a loss leader. So you get heavy traffic on Central Avenue, it works for them, but you take a bus out to the boondocks, that's very expensive. So you try to minimize the cost. And so CDTA has a major concern on how to look at development. And then now they have become very enterprising and efficient. They now provide linkage services to the shopping centers. They provide service to the airport. They provide service to the major corporate developments in the area. So in effect, they found niche markets that they can connect to, and they become much more enterprising in taking care of business, because they find it not only financially good for them, but they're perceived as more of a regional agency. So there's CDTA is doing a much better job than they used to.
And so would you say overall that the goal of perhaps limiting automobile transportation is sort of the sole transportation method? That was a goal that was accomplished?
Well, it's not accomplished. It's still a huge, huge gap. But minor progress. And then, of course, you don't know what these driverless cars and various other things are going to do. But we don't want to go there because we don't know enough about it yet.
So another aspect I thought I'd talk to you about is you taught at the University at Albany SUNY in the Department of Geography and Urban Planning for a while. You were actually, if I'm not mistaken, part of developing their master's program.
Yeah.
And
I was there for 35 years as an adjunct.
It's amazing.
That thing, one of the sheets that I gave you has got a description of it.
And it also seems like the CDRPC utilized interns from the university. So I wondered if you would talk a little bit about the relationship between the CDRPC and higher education institutions like the University at Albany SUNY, or even RPI, things like that, and how that relationship contributed to your planning.
From the university side or the CDRPC side? What are you talking about?
I would say from the CDRPC side.
CDRPC at that time was not that much involved in dealing with the universities at all. It became much more of a project after the university, after the master's program was initiated. There's a lot of connection, and the master's program in planning was primarily designed in the beginning stages to provide training for planners who are already at work, state workers who are in DOT or various other places, to get a master's in planning. So a lot of students came from that perspective. And so university was reaching out, and the planning program that was started in 1981, I think, by Professor Marr and I was involved in that process, was primarily to engage, and at that time the rationale was there was no planning agency, no planning program between downstate and Cornell. There's a big hole in the system. So That was filled through very energetic efforts on the part of Paul Maher to sell the program at the universities. That's how it came about. And it became more and more popular. And so beginning at that time, and lately in the last 15 years or so, we have a good relationship with RPI, good relationship with the University of Albany, downtown campus and stuff like that. But it's relatively recent, the connection between and the community, and the community participation has become a lot of the planning activities we're now doing, projects and so forth, are at the behest of the community. So that's another connection. So so the university undertakes projects at the behest of the community, and that's also another potential gain.
So the Department of Geography and Urban Planning encourages projects where they ask the community sort of for their input in what kind of planning.
No. The community comes to the commission, to the program, and says, we could use some help here. Could you prepare a plan for us? And that happens quite a bit.
And so in that sense, the university sort of, in some ways, serves as a middleman.
Sure. University, not only that, the students get a great benefit because they prepare a plan under the direction of the professor, and they constantly communicate with the community and say, how's this going? Is this what you want? So I'm not that involved in it, but a lot of professors are very much. I did a lot of studio projects, but I was doing short projects, so I didn't have a lot of community involvement. But I did have community involvement through the director of the agency. But a lot of projects that are being done by other professors, where they actually go and create a working relationship and have a board of community board that they present the plan to.
So is there anything else, any other major projects during your time that you would like to highlight?
No, nothing that's significant enough.
Well, so let me ask you this then. What would you consider to be your biggest accomplishment?
Preparing the plan in time, in budget. That was a major. I mean, the commission was quite concerned about it because they don't want to be caught short. And there's a deadline. There's a hard deadline to finish the project by 1975. And we did it. So that was a big deal. I mean, for me, that was a highlight because after that, we did a lot of other housekeeping activities, created data systems, dealt with the damn housing plan that I don't even want to talk about anymore. But business as usual and reaching out and all of that. But those are all what I call after the plan activities. But 75, 76, I would say, peaked in 75 and then went on in selling the project for about a year or so. And I left on June of 1980, went to New York City for doing the regional agency there. Big regional plan for the entire tri-state area.
So I guess let me just ask one thing, because you mentioned the data systems.
Mm.
And I actually think that that's pretty significant. Would you just talk a little more about your data systems and what services those provided?
Well, we created a data newsletter at that time, and primarily what it was to create both monthly and quarterly statistics on economic development, housing starts, a whole bunch of economic and other data that was useful to planners and for developers and so forth. And we consulted with the private sector on developing this data system. And basically, remember at that time we didn't have major computer input, so we did a lot of this stuff laboriously. But now it's all, CDRPC has got some very high quality methods of putting data together. But so the data newsletter came out on a regular basis, economic data primarily, but economic and demographic data. One of the things that we did not do in the early stages was we didn't do a lot of social planning because that was not in our brief. But a lot of the issues that face communities right now are social in nature. And I think CDRPC is getting more involved in providing services in that area. I think Rocky would probably be good to talk to about that.
So I asked you about your biggest accomplishment. If you could go back, is there anything you would do differently?
No. No, I mean, going back, that was a long time ago. Remember that? 1980 I left. It's now 2016. Long time ago.
So since the CDRPC will be celebrating 50 years,
Yeah.
how would you describe its legacy?
CDRPC is a viable institution. It's got a lot of responsibilities and is becoming more and more effective in terms of community involvement. And that is primarily due to a smart staff, good relationships built up over the years between sister agencies, and trust that has been developed over time. So in effect, the commission is no longer an outside player. It's part of the community, and not in the sense of part of a community like a community board or something like that, but community in terms of being perceived as an important player in the larger issues of the day. And I think that's a very big accomplishment.
What challenges do you think they're going to face in the future?
Well, we don't know. We have a new change going on in the United States, and I don't want to speculate about it.
Well, I'll ask it this way then. Would you have any advice for the current CDRPC staff based on your experience? And you have extensive experience in regional planning even outside the Capital District. So what kind of advice do you think you would give?
I don't have any specific advice. I think the main thing is to continue to maintain an honest broker role, continue to expand your knowledge base, be available when you're needed to deal with issues, which are all the things that they do now, and get more and more aware of the problems before they arise. So that means be knowledgeable about, like what you asked a little while ago, be knowledgeable about stuff, not necessarily political, but stuff that is going to come down the pike that you can anticipate and say, hey, we got this issue coming up, we better deal with it now, and at least start making plans for it. So again, I don't know what they're doing now. I mean, lately I haven't touched base with what CDRPC is doing. So most of it is advice that you would give anybody, who are involved in regional planning.
And finally, I actually wanted to ask you a little bit, just because you have such extensive regional planning experience, you worked in Baltimore, Detroit,
Yugoslavia.
You've planned in India, you've planned in London.
Yeah.
How would you compare your experiences in these places to CDRPC and the challenges that you've faced?
Well, the planning processes are different. In the United States, you continue to have a planning process that is very, very much advisory in scope, except for a few metropolitan areas, like say people always talk about St. Paul and Minneapolis, St. Paul. There were a few other regions that have a lot more control over development, but most regional agencies are advisory in nature. Planning in other countries is quite different. For instance, in Europe, the planning processes are very tightly controlled, and the planner who's involved in community planning has got a lot more control of change. In Yugoslavia, when I did the plan there, they had total control of anything that happened, because that was the nature of the development process there. In London, which I was involved in the transportation planning process there, much more loosey-goosey. The London area was divided into 32 boroughs, and each borough was like a county, big. They're very independent. But the Greater London Council, which I worked for, had a huge clout because we control the transportation system. Controlled in a very minute way, so that there was a major plus. So it depends on which country you're talking about. What is the role of a regional agency in terms of control and power? In the United States, most regional agencies, except for transportation, sewer and water systems, these are controllable entities at regional level. They control because they control everything from planning to implementation. Department of Transportation, Port Authority of New York, all these organizations do everything from top to bottom. So they are in total control of not only planning but implementation. But regional planning agencies, they're in the middle. They don't have authority to implement plans. Plans are implemented by other people. So our role in the United States in planning is mostly advisory in nature, but be smart about development processes, because you have to put yourself in the mind of a developer to be able to understand him. So you should know, as a planner, you should know how the development process works. You cannot just say, you shall do this and you shall do that, because they will say, what do you know about this business? So much of the stuff, you get smart about how to deal with these issues, because I used to say, what other countries do by fiat, we do by cooperation. And because it's a mixed economy, we are not an entirely free enterprise system. A lot of capitalists think we're a free enterprise system, but it's not true. A lot of the stuff that happens in a local area is ordained and controlled by infrastructure investment that's already made or will be made, and they better pay attention to it.
And I'll just ask as a follow-up too. So you've explained sort of differences in how you can implement your planning in the U.S. versus other countries. Were you in Baltimore and Detroit in particular? Were you facing similar planning concerns that you described you were facing here in the capital region? Much
more acute, because Baltimore is a very complicated metropolitan area, but Detroit is even worse, because Detroit, remember at the time when those plans were made, both in Baltimore and Detroit, the country was in an ascending curve in terms of economic development. So we made projections for development for the Baltimore region and for Detroit for doubling the population. Detroit metropolitan population was about 4.5 million people when I got there in 65. When I left, it was still there, and then the entire regional population right now is still at 4.5 million. We thought it would go to 8 million people. We forecast such an enormous growth in these regions, but they never happened because suddenly the market fell down. You know, the auto industry went through a big slump. And Baltimore, the same thing. You know, a lot of people were leaving the central city, but the region was stagnant. So lots of the things we forecasted at the region level did not come about. So the plans are interesting, and the basics of the plan was still pretty sound, but the overall macro level forecasting was not very good.
And so, one last question, and this is just something I like to end with. Is there anything I should have asked you about that I didn't?
No, you wanted to stick to CDRPC there, so you got that. I got stories I can tell you about other things, but that's not relevant.
Well, I guess anything else that I should know about your time at the CDRPC?
No, we covered the bases.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For speaking with me today. It was a pleasure.
All right, you got enough?